Hi friends, it's Grace and welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about my favorite books so far that I've read in 2023. And I didn't have really any hard and fast rules for this list. There are 6 books on it that I want to talk about, and I did sort of try to choose one book per series just because I thought it would be easier for me to represent them that way without having this get too out of hand. So that wasn't exactly a rule, but I was successful in choosing, so I figured I may as well run with it. And we have 4 of these being fantasy books and 2 of them not, so at least we have some range, some representation here. But of course I do read primarily fantasy, and so it's not shocking that my favorites are primarily fantasy as well. So the first book that I want to talk about is The Liar's Knot by M.A. Carrick. So this is the second book in the Rook and Rose trilogy, and oh dear, the cats are chasing each other around. I don't know if you could hear that mini stampede, but this is actually the very first book that I finished this year at the start of the year in 2023. And this is one of my favorite series. It might be my favorite unfinished series currently, but it will soon be finished because the finale is coming out in August of this year. But the Rook and Rose trilogy is just so magical, but also so, it's like whimsical and gritty at the same time in a way. So our main character, Ren, begins the series by trying to commit this elaborate con. So she is a con woman where she is trying to impersonate a member of a noble house and kind of infiltrate them, basically just to get money. Like, just because she wants to have some financial security, she's just going to disappear with some money and live out her life without having to worry about where her next meal is going to come from. But there is a lot more complications to it than that. It turns out that this noble house that she is trying to infiltrate really isn't that well off financially anyway. And so Ren is a vibrant character. There are a few other great characters in this series, actually multiple other great characters. And as we continue throughout both books, there is just so much fascinating magic. And at the same time, one of my favorite things about this series is the human side of it, and the fact that this society that they've created, this author duo, is very like queer normative. It is very common in, well, I'm gonna say it's common to be bisexual, but it's definitely just common to kind of have any sexuality in this world. It is very open and accepting, and it is kind of ironic because there is still a lot of prejudice and like almost like racial or cultural tensions, but they certainly don't have anything to do with sexuality and gender. So it's interesting in the sense that you still have a certain type of like prejudice, but you don't have that type. And I do enjoy that aspect of it, but there is certainly like religious and cultural tensions in these books, and the plot is so intricate, and I honestly would love to reread these before the finale comes out, just because I would love to have a full understanding of the plot going into it. But everything is just so well put together and well balanced, and I love these books, and 100% 10 out of 10 recommend them. I forgot to mention, although with The Liar's Knot being the first book I finished in 2023, it's a little bit implied. These books are just going in the order that I read them in 2023. They are not ranked in any other order. So the second one on this list of favorites is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. So I read the first 3 books in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I'm taking a break now, but the first 3 were always my favorites, and while A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings are both great books, A Storm of Swords has always been my favorite. It was my favorite the first time I read the series, and it was my favorite again this time. And I won't really even say anything about the plot, although Game of Thrones plot points are almost kind of ingrained in popular culture at this point, but I still don't want to go into spoilers. But there's just so much that happens in this book that it kind of ends an arc in itself. Like, there are smaller arcs that span the first 3 books, and the end of this book very much is an ending in a sense, even though it's not. Like, the story is still very much going on. But there's so much great character development in here. You get to see into the minds of some characters that you didn't get to see into before, and they are so interesting. And I also personally have always loved a travel story, and there are at least 2 main character arcs whose stories in this book involve a lot of travel and traversing the 7 kingdoms. And there's just there always is, but there's so much politicking, and it's so engaging and interesting to see how people are maneuvering around one another, and how, quite frankly, when they fail, it has disastrous consequences, and we see a lot of that in this book. So it's not exactly that I love the death that occurs, but there certainly are the consequences for your actions in this book. And yeah, this for me is the peak of the series, and hopefully we live to see, hopefully George R. R. Martin lives to see more of the series, but you never know. But for now, this is the best in my opinion. So actually, I've gone slightly out of order because one of these books, I don't have a physical copy of it. So it was actually supposed to be second, but I'll just put it in here, third. I read it before Storm of Swords, but we'll just pretend. So that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. And so this was a gift that my mom actually got for Ben for Christmas, and he was nice enough to let me read it while he was here in January before he took it home with him. And so this I thought it was stunning. So Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is sort of a book about 2 main characters, Sam and Sadie, and it follows the bulk of their lives from the time that they're maybe 11 years old until it follows 25 to 30 years of their lives until they are fully into adulthood. And they form this friendship when they're really young through playing video games together in the hospital. Sam is in the hospital and Sadie is visiting her sister in the hospital. And basically, they form this friendship surrounding video games, and then they lose touch with each other. But when they're in their young adulthood, university, they kind of reconnect because they see each other in the city, and Sadie is developing video games, and she basically gives one to Sam to ask what he thinks of it. And from there, they kind of, it kind of snowballs. They start to work together, and they basically become video game developers. And I'll be honest, this plot at first glance did not seem like something that would be for me, and it's mostly because of the video game thing. And it's not that I have anything against video games or that I dislike them, but I've never been into them that much. So I was kind of thinking oh, I'm not gonna get the significance, I'm not gonna get the emotional impact of some of this stuff. And to an extent, I'm sure that some of that is still true, because this book probably will resonate more with people who did grow up playing all of the games that are kind of referenced in here and through the time periods that are referenced. This is kind of late 90s until present day, but for me, this was a story of the characters and their tumultuous friendship and relationship throughout the years and how they work together. And it's really more of a character-driven emotional story, and that's where it shines, in my opinion. So the video game stuff is still really cool, but the plot is more of a vessel for emotional development, and it also is kind of a vessel for societal commentary in terms of you have a female and a male game developer and how society treats them differently, and what Sadie goes through that Sam doesn't. But you also have great disability rep with Sam, and so there are things that he goes through that Sadie doesn't, and it's sort of vice versa, where you are getting I want to say representative stories from people whose views on their very similar life experiences are just very different because of how they view the world differently. And it was a very hard-hitting book emotionally. It definitely made me cry. And yeah, I know that it was on Goodreads lists and it was a very popular book, and I can see why it was. I thought that it was amazing. The next book up is When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, and this is a very interesting one because this is fiction and nonfiction kind of blended in a very interesting way that I find super engaging. So basically, I'm just going to read the back of this and then use my own words after. So it says that he uses the imaginative resources of fiction to break open the stories of great scientists and mathematicians who expanded our notions of the possible. As they grapple with the most profound questions of existence, these troubled men have strokes of unparalleled genius, alienate friends and lovers, and descend into isolated states of madness. Some of their discoveries revolutionize our world for the better, and others pave the way to chaos and unimaginable suffering. For sometimes discovery brings destruction. And so that's a great summary. Obviously, it's what's literally being used to market the book. But what I love about this is that blend, like I said. So these are the stories of real people, scientists, physicists, mathematicians, who undeniably had immense impacts on the world. And sometimes it's hard to say whether those were positive or negative because, for example, there is an example in here where there's a story of a scientist who ended up developing a gas that was used in the world wars that is extremely, it affects human beings grotesquely, but it also helped to lead to the development of how to produce nitrogen to fertilize fields, and it revolutionized agriculture and it saved millions of lives. So that's just one example where it's you can say that something is objectively bad, but then down the line when it has these other effects, you can no longer necessarily say whether this was only bad. It had some good outcomes as well. And so everything is so complicated, and there is a lot of questions asked in here about whether the development of science is going too far and whether they should figure things out, independent of whether they can make these discoveries, whether they should, what the impacts will be all the way into the future, and the fact that you can never really know these things. And I just really liked that it was told in a super compelling narrative way. And it is, of course, also a really short book. So I don't know, this was just pretty much different from anything I've ever read, and it was super, super cool and fascinating. Okay, so now we're kind of back in my wheelhouse talking about high fantasy. So my fifth favorite book of the year, and just to clarify again, that is fifth in chronological order, not fifth ranked, but that is Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty, and this is the second book in the Daevabad trilogy. And so I thought that all three of the books in this trilogy were great, so it's a tough decision. There's really not that much separating them in quality and how much I enjoyed them, but I've decided that Kingdom of Copper is my favorite out of the three. And this series as a whole, the strengths of Kingdom of Copper are the strengths of the series as a whole. It's the characters, the relationships and friendships between the characters, the magic, and the strength of Nari and Ali as main characters, and how how they persevere and how stubborn and smart they are, and the fact that they stand up for what they believe in. And don't get me wrong, I love the setting. I think it's so vibrant, and I love the mythology that this is pulling from. It's all so interesting, and it really fleshes out the world. But the stars of the show are definitely the characters, because it feels like they are driving the plot forward, and they are making decisions that change the course of things. And I said this in my May wrap-up when I talked about the Empire of Gold, but the thing I love about this series is that even if I can't necessarily predict where it's going, I had this feeling the entire time that the series was going exactly the way that I wanted it to, no notes. I loved the way that the plot developments happened. I loved that the direction that things were going, the time and care that was taken in terms of recovering from betrayal, rebuilding relationships, the time it takes to really build a true friendship and the care that these characters have for one another. It was all fantastic. So this is definitely a favorite series for me now. And like I said, Kingdom of Copper is my favorite, but it's really not too far above the other two books. Finally, and this is a series that I have been loving all year long. This book just happens to be my favorite of them so far, and that is The House of Always by Jenn Lyons. So I have not yet finished this series, which is Chorus of Dragons. I still need to read The Discord of Gods in June. However, this book, The House of Always, the fourth book, it really just continued building on the strengths of the first three. And this is a series where I can't even necessarily describe what it's about. We start off with our main characters like Kieran and Teraith and Janelle, and in the first two books we kind of go through their histories and their stories to this point in a very magical world. There's an empire, there is different dominions on the continent, and there are very different peoples inhabiting those dominions, and there's a lot of wizardry, there is royal houses, there's secret, what's the word I'm looking for? Secret lineages, people kind of discovering their identities. There's magic swords, there's god kings, there's a lot going on. But this book, out of all of them, the setting that was chosen is one of those sort of intimate, forced proximity settings for a group of characters, and it really allowed them to explore emotionally a lot of the recent events that have taken place in the series, while also working towards the ultimate goal of the series. And I just feel like it was such a good balance that this one worked perfectly for me, in the sense that I think the first three books I gave 4.5, 4.5, and then 5, but this one is even better. It's obviously the difference between 5 stars is minimal. However, The House of Always just pulled it all together. It just kept the ball rolling in exactly the way that I was hoping for, and I really like the direction that the end of this series is going. And I can honestly say that it's hard to have expectations in a series like this, because while things that happen do make sense, it's quite possible that things will progress in a way that you didn't expect because information wasn't revealed to you yet. And as long as that information is consistent with the world and consistent with what we've had in the past, then I'm fine with it. And that's kind of what we had in here, where they were working towards a goal the whole book, and at the end they kind of both achieved it and didn't, and I'm really, really looking forward to reading the finale of the series. And this was just perfect, and I'm really hoping that the fifth book hits that same chord. So I don't know that there are any real common threads here, things that my favorites of the year have in common so far, but I can probably say that Rook and Rose, Chorus of Dragons, and the Daevabad trilogy, they all have this sort of new fantasy feeling for me, where they take some sword and sorcery elements of classic fantasy, but really it's a completely fresh feeling setting and characters and everything, and lumping them in together as a sort of type of fantasy isn't really fair because they're all distinct, but I'm kind of just lumping them in as new fantasy rather than classic fantasy. And I feel like that makes sense in a way, but they're all just great examples of where fantasy is and where it's currently going. So I hope that that makes sense. And I've been really loving a lot of the series that I've been reading this year, and it's been great. So please like this video if you liked it. In the comments, let me know what some of your favorites have been from the year, whether you agree with mine or not. I would love to hear your thoughts. And do subscribe if you want to see more content from me. I post new videos on most Mondays and Thursdays. And as always, I'll have my socials as well as the Discord link in the description below if you're interested in any of that stuff. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!